Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for setting the expectations so high. What I wanted to do in my brief introduction is introduce some of the themes in a paper which I published last month entitled A Force for Order, and relate that particularly to the role of UK land forces. And this is very much a personal view of the strategic context for answering the question for our panel, but one I hope that brings into vision the key issues for us. And I think the starting point is actually this much maligned term, grand strategy, because certainly in one meaning of that term, the UK's grand strategy has actually been rather clear since 1949, because it's been based on permanent alliance with our European neighbours and the United States, support for a rules-based international order, and the UK playing an internationalist activist role in those two contexts. And actually, that internationalist, what I call that internationalist grand strategy, is key to understanding all the different questions we then seek to address. And of course, it's different from a nationalist grand strategy. We hedge against the possibility that alliances may one day break up, but we don't hedge very much. The nationalism is not the key to our grand strategy. If it were, then our military priorities would be very different. And many of the questions we ask, therefore, about the employment of the military instrument are about strategy within an alliance. Alliances are the main focus of UK military effort. They've been the main focus of UK military operations over the last couple of decades, and we plan on the assumption that will continue to be the case. And therefore, when we think about the strategic objectives of UK military power, the political objectives of UK military power, we're very often thinking about how we shape alliance policy, alliance strategic objectives. And one of the ways we seek to do that is to take the initiative. There's an interesting trade-off, I think, in terms of influence by a country over an alliance between initiative on the one hand and mass on the other. Simply providing mass to an alliance without a clear indication of what you as a nation want to achieve politically through employment of that mass may not generate influence. But taking the initiative might well do. The PowerPoint slide gives a couple of examples of where the UK, singly or along with others, took the initiative. The UK took the initiative in moving into southern Afghanistan in 2006, along with the Netherlands and Canada, at a time when the United States was more occupied in Iraq. Along with France, we took the initiative in relation to Libya in 2011, at a time when, without those two European powers taking the initiative, there would not have been an operation. And of course, any of you who've talked to Americans over the last period have heard how impressed they are by the fact that the French took the initiative in relation to Mali. They asked for help afterwards, but certainly it was very much a French-led operation. But of course, the downside of taking the initiative is it exposes you to more risk, as indeed most of those examples show. And that's particularly germane to our discussion, because we haven't always been strategically successful in the military operations in which we've been engaged over the last 2 decades. The book which myself and my colleagues at RUSI published last year, entitled Wars in Peace. You can get endless book titles out of War and Peace, by the way. You just have to vary the words in between. But that book argues that in terms of strategic success, achievement of political objectives, making the world a better place from our point of view, rather than the success of the military operations themselves. It's been a very mixed record since the end of the Cold War, and certainly the latter phases of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the Libya operation in 2011, all very questionable in terms of strategic success. So going forward, one of the things I would argue we have to do is learn from those lessons in sketching out what our priorities for the use of land power and therefore for how we shape and plan for land power should be. And one of the central note of caution I would have in that regard is that I think we have to be more cautious about using our military as what I would call a force for change, using external military forces as a primary instrument for transforming foreign societies, as I think we were trying to do in Iraq and Afghanistan. In some ways, actually, the antithesis of a rules-based international order in many ways. But there are other key roles for UK land forces which endure and may in some respects be increased. The primary one, I think, the key actually to a rules-based international order, the most important rule of all, arguably, is the territorial integrity of states and the very strong norm against changing borders by force. And one of the reasons, of course, why Crimea and eastern Ukraine have been seen as such breaks from good international behavior by Russia. But in addition, I think there's a continuing role for military force, for land forces, in supporting weak and fragile states to safeguard their own security, not replacing that role, but supporting that role. And I think, arguably, there's also a potential for more to be done by developed military powers such as ourselves to contribute to UN peacekeeping missions which, after all, we vote for in the UN, we support financially, but at least up to now we've done, I think, too little to support with the key, scarce, enabling resources which most troop-contributing countries cannot supply. And to say a little, to flesh out a little bit what that might mean in relation to the two broad areas of likely UK military engagement over the next period, first of all, in what I would call the wider Middle East. So not simply the Gulf, but the wide area, I guess, from the Sahel all the way over to Pakistan, a region in which we were not without conflict in 2010, but the number and depth of conflicts in that wider region has grown since 2010, even as our confidence in our ability to do anything about them has diminished. And here, I think one of the lessons we should have learned, one of the lessons I think we have learned to some extent, is the importance of local and regional partnerships. But also, those partnerships are rarely alliances. These partnerships are often temporary rather than necessarily permanent in nature, and that creates particular problems as we're seeing in Iraq today. It also, I think, points, and this is a theme the next panel will discuss in much more detail, the need for persistent defense engagement despite its limitations and costs, both of which are substantial. And specifically for the UK, the very breadth and difficulty of conflict in that region does, I think, present us with some choices about where we can contribute to alliance efforts. Where do we have a comparative advantage? Where do we have particular interests? And where? Is it in the smaller GCC countries where the UK already has a significant presence? Might it be in Anglophone West Africa? Some criticism, I think, about the fact that the UK did not do more in relation to Boko Haram. Might it be in places like Kenya and Somalia facing real and growing threats? And do capability questions about equipment choices, how we train our forces, what sort of logistics enablers we need, where we prioritize forward engagement. How far do those capability questions follow from those comparative advantage and geographical choices? And how far, given that we can't do everything, when we do take the initiative, how far can we mitigate the risks of taking the initiative or being the lead by our close alliances with others? And of course, this brings me also to the second axis of UK military engagement going forward, much more important than it was again in 2010 in relation to Russia, where alliance objectives are, most of all, force for order, status quo objectives, preventing further aggression in Ukraine, but also deterring attack, most importantly, deterring attack in Russia. And here, I think, in important respects, very different from the Cold War, because Russia is much weaker in conventional terms, in aggregate conventional terms in NATO, but compensates through nuclear and sub-conventional capabilities in a way which means we need to proceed with care, I would argue, to avoid the danger of inadvertent escalation as a result, partly of that asymmetry in capabilities, but also mutual misunderstanding of objectives. And for the UK, I think, it means that the UK does need an ability, more than it had in the past, to reinforce NATO conventional deterrence on land, at sea, and in the air. And it should and is making a significant contribution to NATO's Readiness Action Plan. It can benefit particularly in working closely with its immediate European neighbours, because that gives us a bit of extra mass, and also many wider political objectives. For a country such as ourselves, which is not always flavour of the month amongst our European partners at a political level, it's important, I think, to reinforce our friendships with our immediate neighbours. But I don't think it makes sense for the UK to put all its military eggs in the NATO versus Russia basket, in part because in a wider context of alliance burden sharing, other countries have a more immediate and pressing interest, particularly on the land vis-a-vis Russia. And it may be that certainly if concerns about Russia grow in coming years, I think we may move back to a situation which, as in the Cold War, Germany becomes the biggest supplier of land forces in relation to deterrence of Russia. We and others all do our bit. We make sure we're there on day one, but we have to balance those capabilities against all the other things in the wider Middle East, which I've talked about. So finally, it will come as no news to you that perceptions have grown over the last year or two that the UK has become a reluctant warrior, that our parliament voted against military action in Syria, though I think the American Congress would have done the same, that there are question marks about our defense spending going forward, and that we were out of Afghanistan in a more complete way than some of our allies and earlier. And I think it is true that taking on prudent new commitments might help to reverse that perception. And it's important for our strategic interests, our strategic influence, that we do reverse that perception that the UK is, as one Washington Post editorial put it, retiring as an international power. But in the end, the key to influence will not only be providing capability, it will be showing strategic success in and restoring faith in the military instrument, and that is going to be much harder. Thank you.